They say wealth is power, yet those who possess everything often find themselves feeling nothing. Castles built from gold still cast shadows of loneliness. The man at the top of the world gazes down upon it, yet something within him remains unfulfilled. Meanwhile, those who own little, who have tasted neither excess nor luxury, move through life with an effortless grace, as if they carry some hidden secret. A man of immense fortune, a millionaire, had spent his life mastering control. Every detail of his empire was calculated, precise, unquestionable. He had built walls high enough to keep out uncertainty, to shield himself from the unpredictable nature of the world. He had wealth, power, influence. Yet, beneath it all, he remained a spectator of life rather than a participant. His days were filled with negotiations, transactions, and expansion. Yet, when silence fell, an unfamiliar emptiness lingered. One evening, as he walked through the grand hall of his mansion, he paused. A sound, delicate yet unfamiliar, reached his ears. Laughter, soft, unrestrained, untouched by concern. His eyes narrowed. It was his son, and before him, in the vast expanse of polished marble, was someone he had never truly looked at before. The maid. She wasn't cleaning, she wasn't serving. She was dancing. And so was his son. It was an effortless rhythm, a movement of pure presence. No hesitation, no performance, just flow. For a moment, he simply watched, unable to look away. Something about the scene unsettled him, as if he were witnessing a reality that had always existed, yet had been hidden from him. Was it possible that true fulfillment had nothing to do with wealth? Nothing to do with control? Had he, in his pursuit of power, overlooked the very essence of life itself? The body moves, but the soul speaks. There is something ancient, something forgotten, woven into the rhythm of a dance. A silent language that predates words, yet conveys truths beyond logic. To dance is to surrender, to align with forces unseen, to exist without resistance. Long before empires were built and men measured their worth in gold, dance was more than just movement. It was a form of communion, a passageway between the physical and the divine. The Sufi mystics, lost in their whirling, believed that to spin was to dissolve into the universe itself. The Hindus spoke of Nataraja, the great cosmic dancer, whose every step shaped creation and destruction. Even in the depths of forgotten civilizations, rhythm was never just for entertainment, it was a gateway to something greater. And yet, here stood a man who had conquered every aspect of his world, witnessing something he could not explain. A woman, a maid, who by all societal measures should have had no power. Yet she moved with a grace that defied the very foundation of his beliefs. His son followed her lead, unburdened by hesitation. Was it instinct? Or was it wisdom of a different kind? One that could not be acquired through wealth or intellect, but only through surrender? Perhaps power does not lie in control. Perhaps knowledge is not the accumulation of facts, but the art of allowing. He had spent a lifetime making calculations, structuring outcomes, eliminating unpredictability. And yet, in this moment, he saw the contrast between his own existence and the simple, effortless joy before him. Could it be that true wisdom is not found in dominance, but in alignment? That real mastery is not about forcing life into submission, but moving with it, as one? The dance was not just movement, it was a language, a conversation between body and spirit, between the seen and the unseen. The millionaire had spent his life surrounded by precision, by rigid structures that he had built to maintain order. And yet, here, in the center of his own home, something unraveled before him. A rhythm that felt more real than anything he had ever controlled. He should have dismissed it, should have turned away. But he couldn't. The woman before him, the maid, was not moving randomly. There was something deliberate about the way she stepped. Something ancient in the way her body surrendered to the rhythm. It was not just dance. It was something else. Something he couldn't yet name. And that unsettled him. He had never paid attention to her before. She was background noise, a presence so ordinary that she had become invisible. A worker, a servant, a function of his household, nothing more. And yet, in this moment, she was something entirely different. His son followed her lead effortlessly, laughing, moving without hesitation. The boy was free, unburdened by expectation, untouched by the weight of knowing too much. But the millionaire was not like his son. He was burdened, and the weight of his knowledge had always convinced him that he was in control. And yet, here was a woman who owned nothing, who held no status, yet carried herself as if she possessed a secret the rest of the world had forgotten. He watched, searching for something logical, something that would explain what he was seeing. But the longer he observed, the more the logic unraveled. Her movements were precise yet effortless, her presence humble yet commanding. He had seen power before, men in boardrooms, leaders of nations, those who held the world in their grasp. But this was different. It was a different kind of power, one that did not seek control, but instead moved in harmony with something greater. And so, he asked the question, "Where did you learn to dance?" The maid paused. For a moment, she simply looked at him, as if deciding whether or not he was ready to know the answer. Then, in a voice quiet yet steady, she spoke. "It was never something I learned. It was something I remembered." The words did not satisfy him. They only deepened the mystery. He prided himself on knowledge, on understanding the mechanics of the world. He knew markets, investments, human behavior. He could predict the rise and fall of industries, yet here, in his own home, he faced something he could not quantify. His curiosity grew. Who was she? Where did she come from? He had never asked before, never thought to care. But now, he needed to know. He called his assistant, requested her records, a name, a history, something to explain the enigma standing before him. The documents arrived quickly, yet they told him almost nothing. She had no traceable family, no formal education beyond the basics. She had worked in different cities, always in simple roles, cleaning, assisting, unnoticed. There was nothing remarkable about her past, and yet, the more he searched, the more it felt as though her existence had been carefully woven into the background of the world. But something stood out. A single detail. One he might have overlooked had he not been looking so closely. A place of birth. A small village, far from the cities, far from the noise of modern life. A name he did not recognize but felt strangely drawn to. And so he searched further. The village was nearly forgotten, barely marked on maps. But in the depths of history, buried beneath layers of lost knowledge, he found something. A name, a reference, a whisper of something ancient. It was said that long ago, before the world became what it is today, there were those who understood life in ways others had forgotten. They did not write their knowledge in books, nor did they seek to spread it through teachings. Instead, they lived it. They carried wisdom not in words, but in movement, in breath, in the way they aligned themselves with the unseen forces that guided existence. There were stories, though few had ever believed them. Stories of those who walked unnoticed, blending into the fabric of ordinary life, testing the hearts of the privileged. They were called many things: guardians, watchers, silent teachers. And they had one purpose: to reveal truth to those who sought it, to those who were ready to see beyond illusion. The millionaire leaned back in his chair, the document spread before him. His mind resisted the idea, fought against it. It was absurd, legends, myths. And yet, the more he tried to dismiss it, the more it echoed in his thoughts. He closed his eyes, remembering the way she moved, the way she carried herself, the presence she held despite her position. Could it be? Number impossible. And yet, he could not deny what he had seen. The next morning, he sought her out. He asked her directly, "Who are you?" She smiled, but there was something in her eyes, something knowing, something ageless. "I am exactly who you believe me to be." The words unsettled him more than any truth she could have given. Days passed. He watched her closely, observed every movement, every word. He questioned everything. And in that questioning, something in him began to shift. For the first time in his life, he saw the world differently. He noticed things he had never noticed before. The way the wind carried whispers through the trees. The way people moved, not just physically, but energetically. He saw rhythms he had once ignored, patterns that had always been there, but had gone unnoticed in the rush of his ambition. The maid continued her work as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed, at least for him. And so, he made a choice. He asked her to teach him. She only nodded. "Are you ready to forget everything you think you know?" And in that moment, he realized the truth. Knowledge is not found in books. Power is not found in control. Wisdom is not something acquired. It is something remembered. And he was finally ready to remember. There is a rhythm to all things. A silent pulse woven into the fabric of existence. The tides rise and fall in a steady breath. The seasons cycle through life, death, and rebirth. The wind does not resist the sky. It moves with it, surrendering to the unseen currents that guide its path. Everything that lives moves in harmony with something greater, except for one species: humans. Somewhere in our pursuit of knowledge, in our need to control and define, we forgot the most fundamental truth of all. Life is not meant to be controlled. It is meant to be danced with. He had spent his life resisting. Every move calculated, every decision weighed. He had built his empire through force, through discipline, through an unyielding will. He had never considered surrender as anything but weakness. But now, as he watched the maid move, he saw something different. Surrender was not passivity. It was not the absence of control. It was mastery of a different kind, the ability to align with the forces that governed existence rather than fight against them. He began to wonder, why was he drawn to this? Why did something as simple as movement shake the foundation of everything he believed? And then he remembered. There was a time when dance was not just a form of entertainment. It was a form of knowing. It was how the ancients connected with the unseen. The shamans of forgotten civilizations would enter a trance, letting their bodies move with the rhythm of the earth, seeking wisdom beyond words. The Sufi mystics spun in circles, dissolving the self into the infinite, merging with the divine through movement. The Taoists spoke of flow, of effortless action, of finding one's place in the great unfolding of the universe by becoming part of its rhythm. What if the body knew something the mind had forgotten? He found himself lost in these thoughts, unable to return to the certainty that had once defined his existence. The maid had become more than just an enigma. She was now a doorway to something he did not yet understand. He had seen wealth, power, influence. He had stood in the presence of kings and leaders, men who could shape the course of nations. Yet, in the quiet of his own home, it was this woman, a servant, a nobody in the eyes of the world, who held the kind of presence he had never encountered before. He wanted to dismiss it, to explain it away as coincidence or illusion. But he couldn't. Something was shifting. And so, he did something he had never done before. He asked a question, not out of expectation, not to gain something, but simply to understand. "Why do you dance?" The maid did not answer immediately. Instead, she smiled, as if the question itself contained more truth than the answer ever could. "Because it is the only way to be free." The words echoed in his mind long after they were spoken. Freedom. He had spent his entire life chasing it, accumulating wealth so he would never be bound by circumstance, building walls so no one could control him, creating a world where he dictated every outcome. And yet, for all his power, for all his control, he had never felt truly free. But she was free. Despite her status, despite her role, she carried herself with a lightness that he had never known, and he envied that. That night, he could not sleep. His mind, trained to solve problems, wrestled with a question it could not answer. How could someone with nothing possess more than him? He sought answers the only way he knew how. Through books, through research, through knowledge. He scoured history, searching for meaning in the wisdom of those who came before him. And what he found only deepened the mystery. Every great tradition spoke of movement as something sacred. The Buddhists spoke of walking meditation, of losing oneself in the rhythm of footsteps. allowing the body to lead the mind to stillness. The martial artists of the East spoke of flow, of the harmony between tension and release, the balance between control and surrender. Even the great philosophers, Plato, Nietzsche, Confucius, all spoke of the body as a vessel for wisdom beyond logic. He had always believed that power came from the mind. That strength was the ability to force one's will upon the world. But what if true strength was something else entirely? What if it was not the ability to impose one's will, but the ability to move with something greater? The next morning he returned to the Maid. This time, he did not ask questions. Instead, he made a request. "Teach me." The words felt foreign on his tongue. He was a man who gave orders, not one who asked to be taught. And yet, here he was, standing before someone the world considered insignificant, asking for something he could not find anywhere else. The Maid studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Are you willing to let go?" He hesitated. He had spent a lifetime holding on, to control, to logic, to certainty. Letting go was not something he knew how to do. And yet, wasn't that the very reason he was here? He nodded. And so, the lesson began. Not with words, not with instructions, but with movement. She did not teach him steps. She did not correct his form. Instead, she simply moved, inviting him to follow. And for the first time in his life, he had to listen. Not with his ears, not with his mind, but with his body. At first, he resisted. His movements were stiff, forced. He tried to lead, to predict, to control, and every time, she would stop. "Stop thinking," she would say. "Feel." It was the hardest lesson he had ever learned. Days passed. Something began to shift. The tension in his body eased. The rigid thoughts that had once ruled his mind started to quiet. He stopped trying to control the rhythm. And instead, he let himself be moved by it. And in that surrender, he found something he had never known before. Peace. Not the fleeting satisfaction that came from success. Not the temporary relief of accomplishment. But something deeper. For the first time, he understood. The greatest power was not in control, but in alignment. Life had never been something to be conquered. It had always been something to move with. He had spent his life resisting the current, fighting against the flow, believing that was what made him strong. But true strength was in letting go, in dancing with existence rather than struggling against it. And as he moved, as he finally surrendered to the rhythm, he felt something he had never felt before. Freedom. Not in wealth, not in power, not in control, but in the simple act of being. And for the first time in his life, he was truly alive. He had spent his life believing that wealth was the answer, that success was the ultimate prize. From a young age, he had been taught that money could solve anything, that security came from accumulation, that the more he had, the more control he wielded over the world around him. And for years, that belief had shaped everything. His empire had grown, his name had become one that commanded respect. He had built a life so meticulously structured, so perfectly calculated, that nothing could threaten it. And yet, standing there, watching his maid move with a freedom he had never known, a quiet, unsettling thought took root in his mind. Had he won the game, only to realize too late that he had been playing the wrong one? It was a thought he did not want to entertain. Because if it was true, if everything he had built, everything he had sacrificed for, was only a distraction from something deeper, then what had his life truly been about? He had always believed that happiness was a destination, something that awaited him once he had achieved enough, secured enough, controlled enough. But standing in the shadows of his own wealth, he felt something he had never allowed himself to feel. Doubt. He had built a mansion, but was it a home? He had amassed fortunes, but did they make him rich? He had spent his life climbing to the top, but had he only been scaling the walls of his own cage? He had read the studies. He knew the research. Scientists had long documented the illusion of wealth, the way happiness plateaus after a certain point, the way money can ease suffering but cannot create meaning. Psychologists had spoken of the hedonic treadmill, how the pursuit of more never truly satisfies, only resets the threshold of desire. And yet, None of that had mattered to him. Until now. Because knowledge is powerless until it becomes personal. And now, watching his son, his own flesh and blood, find more joy in the presence of a simple woman than he had ever seen in the luxuries of their home, it became personal. For the first time, he questioned the very foundation of his life. Was success a path to freedom? Or was it the most elegant prison of all? He thought of the men he had met at the top, the ones who had everything, the ones whose net worth could buy entire cities, whose power extended beyond borders, and yet beneath their finely tailored suits, there was always an emptiness, a hunger that could never quite be satisfied. They were always searching, always chasing, always afraid of losing, afraid of falling, afraid that, despite all they had conquered, they would wake up one day and realize they had nothing of real worth. And yet, he had dismissed it, because he had convinced himself that he was different, that he was building something meaningful, that he was in control. But what if control was the very thing keeping him from living? The thought lingered, haunting him in ways he could not explain, because he had seen with his own eyes what real wealth looked like. It was not in numbers on a screen, not in assets, not in investments, not in the illusion of status. It was in movement, in presence, in the ability to exist fully, without the weight of needing to prove anything. The maid had nothing, yet she was not poor. And now, he was beginning to see why. For the first time, he asked himself a question that he had spent his life avoiding. If everything disappeared tomorrow, if the money, the power, the empire he had built all crumbled into dust, what would remain? Would he still exist, beyond the identity he had crafted for himself? Or would he find himself lost, realizing too late that he had never truly known who he was beyond what he owned? The thought terrified him, because deep down, he knew the answer. And so, he looked at his maid again, truly looked at her, not as a servant, not as someone beneath him, but as someone who had something he did not. And for the first time, he did not feel superior. He felt envious, because she was free, and he was not. His empire, his success, his carefully curated life, it was not a kingdom. It was a cage, and he had been its most loyal prisoner. But now the walls were cracking, and for the first time in his life, he was beginning to wonder. What if the only way to win was to let go? She had been hiding in plain sight. A woman unnoticed, moving through the corners of his home, sweeping floors, preparing meals, yet carrying a presence far greater than he had ever recognized. But now, as he stood before her, the weight of truth settling in his chest, he realized that she was not who he had assumed. Her past was not one of servitude, it was one of wisdom. He had uncovered it by accident. A simple name, spoken in passing. A curiosity that led him to search beyond what was written in her employment records. And what he found unraveled everything he thought he knew. She had once been known, not as a maid, but as a teacher, a guide sought after by scholars, leaders, those who wished to understand the depths of existence itself. There had been a time when people traveled across great distances just to hear her words, to sit in her presence, to learn the art of living. And yet, she had disappeared. Walked away from recognition, from influence, from a life that others would have clung to. She had chosen anonymity, chosen to step into a world where no one would look at her twice. Why? The question burned within him. But then, he thought of the world he knew. A world that placed value on status, on prestige, on titles and ownership. A world that measured worth in currency and success in the eyes of others. Perhaps she had left because she understood something he did not. Perhaps she knew that wisdom, true wisdom, could not be possessed. And in that moment, he saw her not as a servant, not as an employee, but as something far greater. A guide, a mirror, a lesson he had spent his entire life overlooking. And now, for the first time, he was ready to learn. He stood at the edge of a decision that would define everything. The life he had built, a fortress of power, precision, and control, stood on one side. And on the other, something unknown. A path that could not be measured in wealth or status, but in something far more elusive. For the first time, he saw the truth. The numbers in his bank account, the towering walls of his estate, the empire he had spent decades constructing. None of it had ever made him truly free. He had spent his life commanding the world, bending it to his will. But in doing so, he had bound himself to an existence of rigid certainty. And now, his son stood before him, small hands reaching out, an invitation without words. The boy had learned what his father had never been taught: to move, to let go, to exist in the rhythm of life without fear. He did not hesitate, did not calculate. He simply danced. The millionaire's heart pounded. The choice was simple, yet impossibly difficult. To join, to surrender, to step into something beyond control, or to turn away, to remain in the comfort of the world he knew. He took a breath. And in that moment, for the first time in his life, he did not think. He stepped forward. And he danced. We spend our lives chasing wealth, believing that the accumulation of things will grant us security, purpose, meaning. We build, we acquire, we conquer, convinced that the more we control, the freer we become. But in the end, is it wealth that serves us, or do we become its servants? The millionaire had everything the world told him he should desire: power, status, a legacy carved into the foundations of industry. Yet, in the presence of a woman who owned nothing, he had seen something he had never encountered before. A kind of richness that could not be measured, a kind of freedom that had never been offered to him. And now, the question remains: what is true wealth? Is it the security of material success, the comfort of knowing that the world bends to your will? Or is it the ability to let go, to move freely, unburdened by the illusions of ownership and control? Perhaps the answer is not one that can be spoken. Perhaps it is something felt, something known only in the quiet moments, when the weight of ambition fades and we are left with nothing but ourselves. He had spent his life believing he was the master, the one who commanded and others obeyed. But in the end, it was the one he had overlooked, the one who had served him, who became his greatest teacher. And so, the final paradox reveals itself. Sometimes, those we believe to be beneath us are the very ones who lift us to a place we could never reach on our own.